You have a number in your head right now. Maybe it's 60, maybe it's 65, maybe, if you're feeling optimistic, it's 55. That number is the age you plan to stop working, the age you've been quietly counting down to since your very first paycheck. But here's what nobody told you. That number wasn't chosen by you. It wasn't based on science. It wasn't designed around when your body slows down or when your mind needs rest. That number was invented by a 74-year-old German politician in 1889, and he picked it because he calculated that most people would die before they ever reached it. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how one man's political gamble became the invisible clock ticking inside every working person's life, and why the system he built was never meant to give you freedom. It was meant to keep you working. A world without retirement. Try to imagine a world where the concept of retirement simply doesn't exist. Not a world where people can't afford to retire. A world where the idea itself has never occurred to anyone. Where no one, rich or poor, has ever thought, "I'll work until a certain age and then I'll stop." For roughly 99.9% of human history, that was the world. People didn't retire. They worked until they physically couldn't, and then they depended on the mercy of their families or the charity of strangers. There was no safety net, no pension, no government check arriving in the mail, no savings account you could draw from at a magic age. You were useful, or you were a burden. Those were the options. In medieval Europe, if you were a farmer, and most people were, you worked the land until your back gave out. If you were lucky, your children took over and let you stay. If you weren't lucky, you ended up begging at the church door. The elderly who had no family and no assets faced a grim reality. They either found a monastery willing to take them in, or they starved. This wasn't cruelty in the way we think of it. It was simply how the world worked. The economy was built on physical labor. The moment your body stopped producing, your economic value dropped to zero, and economies, especially pre-industrial ones, had very little room for people who consumed without producing. Even in ancient Rome, the closest thing to a retirement system was reserved for soldiers. After 20 to 25 years of service in the legions, a Roman veteran could receive a plot of land or a cash payment, what they called the premium militare. Emperor Augustus formalized this in 6 AD with the aerarium militare, a military treasury funded by a tax on inheritances and sales. But this was a reward for men who had spent decades killing on behalf of the empire. It wasn't retirement as a concept. It was a severance package for war. For everyone else, merchants, craftsmen, slaves, farmers, there was nothing. You worked, you aged, you hoped someone would feed you. In China, Confucian tradition placed the burden of elder care squarely on children. Filial piety wasn't just a cultural value. It was a legal obligation, enforced by imperial law. In Japan, the concept of inkyo allowed a household head to formally hand over authority to a successor, but only if there was a successor willing to take it, and only if the household could afford to support a non-working member. These weren't retirement systems. They were family arrangements, fragile and entirely dependent on the goodwill of the next generation. The idea that society as a whole, not your children, not your guild, not your church, but the collective apparatus of the state, owed you a period of rest at the end of your working life. That idea had never existed, anywhere, in any civilization, until one man decided to invent it, not out of kindness, but out of fear. The age of the poorhouse. Fast forward to the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution has transformed the world. Millions of people have left the countryside and packed themselves into cities to work in factories, mines, and mills. The old system, where you grew old on the family farm and your children took care of you, has shattered. Young people are leaving home to chase wages. Extended families are breaking apart, and for the first time in history, huge numbers of elderly people find themselves alone in cities with no savings, no family nearby, and no way to earn a living. The solution that emerged was the poorhouse. And if you've never read about what poorhouses were actually like, the reality is worse than you'd guess. In the United States, by the mid-1800s, nearly every county had a poorhouse, sometimes called an almshouse. These were institutions where the destitute elderly were sent when they had no other option. They weren't care homes. They were closer to prisons. Residents were often forced to work, given minimal food, housed in overcrowded dormitories alongside the mentally ill, the disabled, and sometimes criminals. A report from 1857 described the poorhouse in New York as a place where human beings were huddled together like brutes, with the old and the dying lying on straw beds in unheated rooms. The point of the poorhouse wasn't compassion, it was deterrence. The conditions were kept deliberately harsh to discourage people from seeking help. The message was brutally clear: do whatever it takes to avoid ending up here. Save money, rely on family, work until you drop. The poorhouse exists to remind you what happens if you fail. And across the Atlantic, in Britain, the workhouse system operated on the same philosophy. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act was specifically designed to make life inside the workhouse worse than the worst conditions outside it. The elderly weren't exempt. If you had no savings and no family willing to take you in, the workhouse was your final destination. This was the world into which Otto von Bismarck was about to introduce an idea so radical that it would reshape the entire structure of human life, not because he cared about old people, because he was terrified of something else entirely. Bismarck's gamble. Otto von Bismarck was not a humanitarian. He needs to be understood clearly on that point, because what he did in 1889 is often taught as a moment of social progress. It wasn't. It was a calculated act of political survival. Germany in the 1880s was a pressure cooker. The Industrial Revolution had created a massive urban working class, millions of factory workers, miners, and laborers who worked 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, in conditions that routinely maimed and killed them. Wages were low, housing was miserable, and an increasingly organized socialist movement was telling these workers that the system was rigged against them, that the wealthy industrialists and the aristocracy were the enemy, and that revolution was the answer. Bismarck had already tried the stick. In 1878, he pushed through the anti-socialist laws, which banned socialist organizations, shut down their newspapers, and gave police the power to break up their meetings. He made it illegal to spread socialist ideas. He had socialist leaders arrested and exiled. It didn't work. The socialist vote kept growing. Every election, more socialist candidates won seats in the Reichstag. The movement was growing stronger, not weaker, and Bismarck knew that repression alone would eventually fail. If workers had nothing to lose, they would revolt. He'd watched the Paris Commune in 1871, when French workers seized control of the entire city, and the memory haunted him. So he tried the carrot. His logic was blunt, and he barely bothered to disguise it. In a speech to the Reichstag in 1881, he said the goal was to create among the propertyless classes a sense that the state was not just a necessity, but a beneficent institution. He wanted workers to feel that they had a stake in the existing order, that the government was giving them something. That revolution would mean losing what they'd gained. If a worker has a pension waiting for him at 70, he's less likely to build a barricade at 40. That was the calculation. Not welfare, insurance, against uprising. The German socialists, ironically, opposed the plan. They saw it for exactly what it was, a bribe. August Bebel, the leader of the Social Democratic Party, denounced it in the Reichstag as an attempt to buy workers' loyalty on the cheap. The socialists wanted systemic change, shorter hours, higher wages, worker control. Bismarck was offering a distant promise of rest in exchange for decades of obedience. The socialists knew the difference. Most workers, ground down by exhaustion and poverty, did not. The strategy rolled out in 3 phases. In 1883, Bismarck introduced health insurance for workers. In 1884, he added accident insurance. And then in 1889, the final piece, the Old Age and Disability Insurance Act. This was the birth of modern retirement. The math that made it cheap, the 1889 law, guaranteed a pension to workers who had paid into the system and reached the age of 70, not 65. That detail matters enormously, and it's one of the most commonly misunderstood facts in the entire history of social policy. Bismarck set the age at 70 because he and his advisors had studied the actuarial tables. They knew exactly what they were doing. In 1889, life expectancy at birth in Germany was roughly 40 years for men. Now that number is misleading. It was dragged down dramatically by infant and child mortality. A German man who survived to age 20 could expect to live into his early 60s. But even with that adjustment, reaching 70 was rare. Estimates suggest that only about 10% of the workforce would live long enough to collect a pension. Read that again. The system was designed so that the vast majority of people who paid into it would never receive a single payment from it. Workers contributed a portion of every paycheck. Their employers matched it, and the state added a small subsidy. Money flowed in steadily, but very little flowed back out, because the people who were supposed to benefit kept dying before they qualified. It was a pension system that functioned, in practice, as a tax. Workers paid, the state collected, and the promise of rest at the end was just distant enough to keep people obedient without ever costing very much. Bismarck himself was 74 years old when the law was passed. He had been collecting a generous state income his entire career. The irony of a wealthy 74-year-old aristocrat telling factory workers they could rest at 70, after decades of 14-hour days in conditions he'd never experienced, apparently occurred to no one in the Reichstag. Or if it did, no one said it aloud. The number that stuck. Here's where the story takes a turn that still shapes your life today. In 1916, in the middle of World War I, Germany quietly lowered the pension age from 70 to 65. The war had decimated the workforce. The economy was in chaos. The change was partly practical. Fewer workers were reaching 70 anyway during wartime, and partly a recognition that 70 had always been unrealistically high. But 65 wasn't based on any medical study of when the human body breaks down. It wasn't rooted in psychology or biology. It was an administrative adjustment made during a war, and it stuck. When other countries started building their own pension systems, they looked at Germany's model, and they copied the number. When Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act in 1935, his Committee on Economic Security studied existing pension systems around the world. They considered setting the retirement age at 60, but the actuaries calculated that would make the system too expensive. They considered 70, but that seemed politically unacceptable during the Great Depression, when millions of elderly Americans were already destitute. They settled on 65. The committee's own records show that the choice was driven primarily by financial feasibility, what the system could afford to pay, not by any assessment of when workers should stop working. And just like in Bismarck's Germany, the math was favorable for the government. In 1935, life expectancy at birth in the United States was about 61 years. Again, that number is skewed by infant mortality. A 21-year-old American male could expect to live to about 65, which meant that, statistically, the average worker would die right around the time they became eligible for benefits. The system was solvent because it was designed around the assumption that most people wouldn't use it for very long. Country after country adopted similar models throughout the 20th century. Britain formalized its state pension in 1946 under the Beveridge Plan. France, Italy, Japan. Each one built a retirement system, and most of them anchored it around the same age range, not because 65 was a universal truth about human aging, but because Germany did it first, America copied it, and everyone else copied America. A number plucked from an actuarial table in wartime Germany became the invisible finish line for billions of human lives. Nobody voted on it. Nobody debated whether 65 was the right age for human beings to stop contributing and start resting. It was a fiscal decision, And then it became a fact of life so deeply embedded that most people alive today have never once questioned where it came from. Here's something that makes the arbitrariness even more stark. Different countries adopted different ages, and the variations had nothing to do with biology. France chose 60. Norway chose 67. Some countries set different ages for men and women, not because women's bodies aged differently, but because the actuarial math worked out. The age at which you're old enough to stop working depends entirely on which country you happen to be born in. Your body doesn't know the difference. The spreadsheet does. The golden age. That wasn't for a brief window in the 20th century, roughly the 1950s through the 1980s. Retirement actually worked the way most people imagine it's supposed to, at least in wealthy, industrialized nations. The post-war economic boom created a historically unusual situation. Populations were young, birth rates were high, which meant a large base of working-age people paying into the system. The number of retirees was relatively small because life expectancy, while rising, still kept retirement periods short. A man who retired at 65 in 1950 could expect to collect a pension for maybe 8 to 10 years. The ratio of workers to retirees was favorable. In the United States, there were roughly 16 workers paying into Social Security for every one person drawing from it. Corporations, especially in the United States, offered defined benefit pension plans. You worked for a company for 30 years, you retired, and the company paid you a monthly check for the rest of your life. The amount was fixed, predictable, and guaranteed. It was the company's risk to manage, not yours. By 1980, roughly 38% of private sector workers in the United States had a defined benefit pension. This was the era that created the retirement dream, the vision of a well-earned rest after decades of hard work, a house that's paid off, grandchildren visiting on weekends, maybe a fishing boat. It felt permanent. It felt like a natural stage of human life. But it was an anomaly, a brief golden window created by a very specific set of demographic and economic conditions that were already starting to unravel. The Great Shift in 1978, the United States Congress passed the Revenue Act, a sweeping tax reform bill. Buried deep inside it was a provision called Section 401K. It was obscure, technical, and almost nobody noticed it. The provision was designed to clarify the tax treatment of deferred compensation plans, basically a question about when executives should pay taxes on bonus income. A benefits consultant named Ted Benna noticed something in the language that others had missed. He realized that Section 401K could be used to create a new type of retirement savings account, one where employees could contribute a portion of their own salary before taxes, and employers could match some of that contribution. He pitched the idea to a client, set up the first 401K plan in 1981, and within a few years, the concept had spread across corporate America. What happened next was one of the most consequential shifts in the history of labor, and it happened so gradually that most people never realized what they were losing. Companies began freezing and terminating their defined benefit pension plans. The guaranteed pension, where the company bore the investment risk and promised you a fixed income for life, was expensive to maintain, difficult to predict, and a drag on quarterly earnings. The 401K was cheaper, simpler, and best of all, from the company's perspective, it shifted the entire risk onto the employee. Under a pension, if the stock market crashed, that was the company's problem. Under a 401K, it's yours. Under a pension, if you lived to 95, the company kept paying. Under a 401K, if your savings run out at 80, that's your problem too. By 2023, only about 15% of private sector workers in the United States had access to a defined benefit pension, down from 38% just 4 decades earlier. The pension didn't disappear because workers rejected it. It disappeared because it was more profitable for companies to stop offering it, and the 401K, which was never designed to be anyone's primary retirement plan, became the only plan most people had. Ted Benna himself has spoken publicly about this transformation with something close to horror. In interviews, he's called the 401k system a monster and expressed deep concern that it was never intended to replace traditional pensions. The tool he created for tax efficiency became the foundation of an entire nation's retirement system, not by design, but by corporate convenience. And the results speak for themselves. Studies consistently show that the median 401k balance for Americans approaching retirement is far below what they would need to sustain themselves for 20 or 30 years without working. Many have saved nothing at all. The system assumes that ordinary people working full-time jobs, raising children, paying mortgages, will also become skilled investors capable of navigating decades of market volatility. That assumption has proven, for millions of people, to be catastrophically wrong. The pension said, "We'll take care of it." The 401k says, "Good luck." And somehow, this was framed as freedom. The demographic time bomb. Remember the math that made Bismarck's system work? Few people lived long enough to collect. Many workers paid in. The ratio was sustainable. Now reverse every single one of those variables. People today are living dramatically longer than at any point in human history. A person retiring at 65 in 2025 can reasonably expect to live another 20 years. Some will live 30 or more. That's not 8 to 10 years of pension payments. That's 2 to 3 decades of income with no labor to fund it. At the same time, birth rates across the developed world have collapsed. In Japan, in South Korea, across Europe, in much of the Americas, women are having fewer children. That means fewer young workers entering the labor force, fewer people paying into pension systems, and a shrinking base supporting a growing number of retirees. The ratio has inverted. In the United States, the number of workers per Social Security beneficiary has fallen from 16 to 1 in 1950 to roughly 2.8 to 1 today. In Japan, it's even more extreme. In Italy, Germany, and Spain, the numbers are heading in the same direction. Governments know this. They've known it for decades. And their primary response has been to quietly raise the retirement age. France erupted in months of strikes and protests in 2023, when President Macron pushed the retirement age from 62 to 64. In the United Kingdom, the state pension age is already scheduled to rise to 67 by 2028, with proposals to push it to 68 or beyond. Denmark has tied its retirement age directly to life expectancy projections, which means the finish line moves further away every time medicine gets better at keeping you alive. Think about what that means. The age at which you're allowed to stop working is being determined by how long actuaries predict you'll live. The longer you're expected to survive, the longer you're required to work. The system doesn't celebrate your longevity. It monetizes it. When the French took to the streets over 2 years of additional work, the rest of Europe watched nervously. Not because the protests were unusual, but because every government in Europe knew they would eventually need to do the same thing. The math doesn't lie. Either taxes go up, benefits go down, or the age goes up. There is no fourth option, and raising the age is the one that generates the least immediate political pain, until someone actually does it. In South Korea, one of the fastest aging societies on Earth, the elderly poverty rate is staggering. Nearly 40% of people over 65 live in relative poverty, the highest rate in the developed world. Many elderly Koreans work well into their 70s and 80s, not by choice but by necessity, collecting cardboard and recyclables on the streets of Seoul. The pension system was introduced too late, contributes too little, and covers too few. It's a preview of what happens when the promise of retirement collides with demographic reality. The illusion of the finish line. Step back for a moment and look at the full arc of what happened. In 1889, a politician who was afraid of revolution created a promise that most workers would never live to collect. That promise was designed to pacify, not to liberate. It was a political tool dressed up as generosity. That promise crossed the Atlantic, was adopted by dozens of countries, and gradually transformed into something people believed they were entitled to, a finish line at the end of a working life, a reward for decades of labor, a fundamental structure of modern existence. The idea that life divides neatly into three acts, education, work, retirement, became so deeply embedded in culture that questioning it feels almost absurd. But that three-act structure isn't natural. It's not biological. It's not inevitable. It was invented, recently, by specific people, for specific reasons that had nothing to do with your well-being. The age of 65 wasn't a discovery about the human body. It was a budget calculation. The pension wasn't a gift to workers. It was a strategy to prevent revolution. The 401k wasn't a retirement plan. It was a tax loophole that corporations exploited to offload their obligations. Every layer of the system you've been taught to trust was built by someone who was solving their own problem, not yours. And yet, you've organized your entire life around it. You've counted the years until you reach that number. You've made financial decisions, career decisions, life decisions based on the assumption that at some age, an age chosen by strangers in a different century, you'll finally be free. The average person spends roughly 90,000 hours of their life at work. That's not a statistic. That's a decade of continuous, unbroken time. And the entire architecture of when you start spending those hours, how many you spend per week, and when you're allowed to stop was designed by people who are not thinking about you. The clock, that's still ticking. The pension crisis isn't coming. It's already here. Across the developed world, governments are confronting the same impossible equation. People are living longer. Fewer workers are entering the system. The costs of healthcare for aging populations are skyrocketing, and the pension promises made to previous generations, promises that assumed a world of high birth rates, short retirements, and endless economic growth, are becoming mathematically impossible to keep. The World Economic Forum has projected a global retirement savings gap that could reach hundreds of trillions of dollars by the middle of this century. That's not a theoretical number. It represents real promises made to real people, promises that many governments already know they cannot fulfill. The quiet solution, the one being implemented in country after country without much public discussion, is to push the age higher, reduce the benefits, means test the eligibility, and shift more of the burden onto individuals. Save more, invest smarter, work longer. The message to the current generation is fundamentally different from the message their grandparents received. Their grandparents were told, "The system will take care of you." Today's workers are being told, "Take care of yourself." Which brings us back to where we started. That number in your head. The age you've been planning for, saving for, counting down to. That number was set by a German chancellor who wanted to outmaneuver socialists, copied by an American president navigating a depression, and adjusted over a century by actuaries and politicians trying to balance budgets. Not one of them was thinking about your life, your health, your dreams, what you would do with freedom if you had it. You've been living on a clock that someone else built, following a schedule that someone else designed, toward a finish line that keeps moving. You didn't design this timeline. You didn't choose when the clock starts or when it's supposed to stop. You inherited it from a chancellor who feared revolution, from actuaries who optimized for solvency, from corporations who optimized for profit. Every piece of the system was built to solve someone else's problem, and yet it became the scaffolding of your entire adult life. The strangest part? Nobody ever asked you to agree to any of it. You were born into a world where the rules were already written. The school to work to retirement pipeline was already laid. The age was already set. And by the time you were old enough to question any of it, you were already deep inside the machine, counting the years until the number in your head finally arrived. Closing. Every morning, billions of people wake up and go to work. And somewhere in the back of their minds, there's a number, a year, an age, a date, when they believe they'll finally get to stop. That number feels as permanent as gravity, as natural as breathing. But it was invented by one man, in one country, for one reason, and it had nothing to do with giving anyone rest. The next time someone asks you when you plan to retire, maybe the real question is, who decided that for you? If this changed the way you think about the clock you're living on, subscribe. We pull apart the invisible rules you follow every day and show you who wrote them.